It was a quiet evening when Alex decided to take the long, isolated road back home after a late-night meeting. The moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows that danced across the trees. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the sound of his tires on the wet road. Suddenly, a strange chill swept through the car, making Alex's skin crawl. He glanced at the rearview mirror. For a moment, he swore he saw something move, just a fleeting shadow. His breath caught in his throat as a voice, barely audible, whispered from the darkness, "You shouldn't be here." Alex's heart skipped a beat as the whisper echoed in his ears. He quickly glanced around, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter, but there was nothing, no one around him. The road was empty, stretching out into the dark forest. The voice came again, this time clearer, more urgent. "Turn back. It's not safe." He felt a cold sweat form on his brow. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Who was out there? Was it just his mind playing tricks on him? But the voice, it wasn't in his head. It was real. He pressed his foot harder on the gas, trying to shake off the unease creeping up on him. As the car picked up speed, the trees along the road seemed to close in, their dark silhouettes more oppressive now. Suddenly, his headlights flickered, and for a split second, everything went black. The car jerked to a halt. Silence. Complete and utter silence. Alex froze. Not a single sound. No rustling leaves. No hum of the engine. Nothing. Just the heavy, suffocating quiet. Then, from the darkness, he heard it again. A whisper, close enough to feel the cold breath on his neck. "You're not alone." Alex's heart skipped a beat as the whisper echoed in his ears. He quickly glanced around, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. But there was nothing, no one around him. The road was empty, stretching out into the dark forest. The voice came again, this time clearer, more urgent. "Turn back. It's not safe." He felt a cold sweat form on his brow. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Who was out there? Was it just his mind playing tricks on him? But the voice, it wasn't in his head. It was real. He pressed his foot harder on the gas, trying to shake off the unease creeping up on him. As the car picked up speed, the trees along the road seemed to close in, their dark silhouettes more oppressive now. Suddenly, his headlights flickered, and for a split second, everything went black. The car jerked to a halt. Silence, complete and utter silence. Alex froze. Not a single sound. No rustling leaves, no hum of the engine. Nothing. Just the heavy, suffocating quiet. Then, from the darkness, he heard it again. A whisper, close enough to feel the cold breath on his neck. "You're not alone." Alex's breath caught in his throat. The whisper, so close now, sent a wave of ice through his veins. He quickly looked around, but there was nothing. Just the dark, dense trees and the empty road stretching ahead. His hands trembled on the wheel as he tried to start the car again. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. But something felt different. The air was colder. As the car moved forward, the forest around him seemed to darken even more, the trees now bending inward, almost as if they were watching him. Alex's mind raced. He had never been this far down this road before, and the strange whispers had left him shaken. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to get out of there, but his curiosity pushed him forward. The road curved sharply ahead, and as Alex rounded the bend, he saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. His heart slammed against his chest. It was a person. No, it was too still, too unnatural. The figure wore a dark cloak that seemed to blend into the night, and its face was obscured by shadows. As Alex approached, the figure slowly turned its head towards him, revealing nothing but darkness where its eyes should have been. The car's headlights flickered again, and for a brief moment, the figure was gone. Alex slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. His breath quickened, his hands slick with sweat. He was alone, but the feeling of being watched never left. Before he could react, the whisper came once more, now clear as day. "You've seen it now." It's too late to leave. The darkness outside seemed to pulse, as if alive. The air grew heavier, and Alex's vision began to blur. His heart raced. Was this a nightmare? A trick of his mind? But the figure had been real, and so had the voice. Alex could feel his pulse in his ears, the silence stretching into an uncomfortable stillness. He looked out of the car window, half expecting to see the figure reappear in the shadows, but there was nothing. His headlights illuminated only the endless stretch of road ahead. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. The air felt thick, like the entire world was holding its breath. He slowly pressed the gas pedal again, his mind racing. Should he turn back? But something inside him urged him forward. Something was drawing him deeper into the night, into the unknown, as if the road itself was calling him. Just then, a flash of movement caught his eye in the distance. A flicker, just a glimpse, of something moving between the trees. Alex froze. It had been too quick, too fleeting to make out what it was, but his instincts screamed that it wasn't just an animal. He leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. Another movement. This time, he could see it more clearly. A figure, no longer a shadow, but standing near the edge of the road, watching him. He couldn't make out any details, but he could feel the weight of its gaze. It wasn't like any person he had seen. The figure stood perfectly still, not even a slight breeze moving its cloak. Alex's hands shook, but he couldn't look away. What was it? Who was it? He pressed the brakes again, his body rigid. "Is someone out there?" he called out, his voice shaky. No answer. And then, just as his mind began to question whether he had imagined it all, the whisper returned. It wasn't outside the car this time. It was inside, right next to his ear. "Don't look at it." Alex whipped his head around to the passenger seat, but it was empty. He wasn't sure whether he should be relieved or terrified. The voice wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a command, a warning, as if it knew exactly what he was about to do. He turned back to the road, his gaze locked on the figure. It hadn't moved, and yet, somehow, it seemed closer now. He could feel its presence, like an invisible hand creeping up his spine. He quickly glanced in the rearview mirror again, but the road behind him was empty, the trees just as dark and lifeless as before. Alex's grip on the wheel tightened as the figure ahead of him seemed to pulse in the darkness, its presence growing more unsettling by the second. The whisper, now deeper and more commanding, echoed in his mind. "You're not meant to see it, not yet." His breath quickened. He wasn't sure whether he should stop or drive past, but it was too late to turn around. The figure was standing in the middle of the road, as though waiting for him to make the first move. The darkness around it seemed to twist and warp, almost like it was alive. The trees, which moments ago had seemed still, now bent unnaturally, their branches reaching towards the figure as if drawn by an invisible force. Alex's heart thudded louder in his chest. He could feel his pulse in his throat, his hands cold with sweat. He had to know. He couldn't turn back now, not after everything that had happened. With trembling hands, he pushed the gas pedal harder, slowly creeping toward the figure, his eyes never leaving it. As the car neared, the figure didn't move. It stood like a shadow, darker than the night itself, and yet it felt wrong. The air seemed to grow heavier, the silence oppressive. Alex could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise as he got closer, the temperature dropping rapidly inside the car. When he was just a few feet away, the figure tilted its head slightly, and a chill ran down his spine. It spoke, but its voice wasn't human. It was a sound like the rustling of dead leaves, like the very earth itself speaking. "You have entered the wrong place, Alex." Alex slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. The figure didn't move, but he could feel its gaze burning into him, its presence suffocating. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure disappeared. Not moved, vanished, as though it had never been there at all. Alex's breath came in short gasps as he scanned the area, his eyes wide. The road was empty again. No figure, no movement, just the dark, empty forest surrounding him. But then, a new whisper. This time it wasn't from the darkness. It was inside his head. "You're not alone. It's already begun." Alex's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the empty road, the eerie silence pressing down on him like a weight. The figure was gone, but the voice, that chilling whisper, was still lingering in his mind. He could feel it crawling through his thoughts, clawing at his sanity. His hand trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, trying to regain some sense of control. He looked around frantically, half expecting the figure to reappear in the trees, but there was nothing. Just darkness. The woods seemed to close in on him, the shadows stretching further with every passing second. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. This couldn't be real. He had to be imagining things. But the voice, it wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a constant presence, echoing through his thoughts, growing louder with each passing moment. "You shouldn't have come here. It knows you. It's waiting." Suddenly, the car lurched forward. Alex slammed on the brakes again, his eyes wide. The road in front of him had changed. No, it had twisted. Where there had been an open stretch, there was now a narrow, winding path, bordered by thick trees that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. The trees, now gnarled and twisted, leaned towards the road like a wall. He couldn't turn back. The road behind him was gone, swallowed up by the forest. His pulse quickened. How had this happened? How had he ended up here? Desperately, he tried to reverse, but the car stalled, as if someone was preventing it. He turned the key, but the engine sputtered and died. Panic surged through him. He opened the door, hoping to run, but the cold air that greeted him made him freeze in place. The forest felt alive, as if it were watching him, waiting. Then, through the thick trees ahead, something moved. A shape. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there, closer than it had ever been before. Alex's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't tell if it was human or something else, but the shadows around it shifted in ways that defied logic. It was as if the night itself had come alive. He reached for his phone to call for help, but the screen was blank. No signal. Nothing but the same eerie silence. "Help me," he whispered to himself, barely able to believe his own words. But the whisper, that same haunting voice, answered back. "You never left." Alex's mind was racing, his heart beating like a drum in his chest. The voice had spoken again, its words sinking deep into his bones. "You never left." What did it mean? Was this some twisted dream, or was he truly trapped in this nightmare? His eyes darted to the forest, trying to make sense of the movement he had seen, but it was gone. The shadows shifted like liquid, folding in on themselves. The trees were now twisting in unnatural angles, their branches reaching toward him like claws. Suddenly, a low growl reverberated from the woods. Alex's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was something deeper, more menacing, as if the forest itself was alive, breathing, watching. He slammed the car door shut, the sound echoing in the dead air. "This isn't real," he muttered, but even he didn't believe it anymore. His phone screen flickered back to life, showing a low battery warning. No signal, nothing. He swiped through the screen, hoping for a connection, but there was no hope. Then, the whisper came again. "You will never leave this place unless you understand why you're here." Alex's hands gripped the wheel tighter. What did it want from him? What was this place? The car suddenly lurched forward, jerking him back in his seat as the engine sputtered back to life. But it wasn't the same road. The familiar path had disappeared. In front of him was a stone archway, half covered with creeping vines. Alex hesitated. The archway seemed impossibly ancient, as though it didn't belong here, as if it had been there for centuries, forgotten by time. There was something so wrong about it, yet he couldn't look away. The air around it felt thick, charged with a strange energy. Without thinking, Alex drove toward it, the car creeping slowly through the archway. As he passed through, the temperature dropped even further, a cold so biting that it numbed his skin. The car's headlights flickered wildly, casting strange shadows against the stone walls that now lined the road. "Leave now, Alex," the voice whispered, this time not from the woods, but from the very air around him. "It's too late to turn back." Suddenly, the car stopped. Not by his doing. The engine cut out completely. The darkness pressed in from every side, suffocating and heavy. Alex's hands were shaking, his eyes wide as he stared ahead at the archway, now far behind him. The forest had vanished. In its place was an endless stretch of dark, barren land. Alex opened the door, his legs unsteady as he stepped out of the car. The air was still, the silence unbearable. There was nothing here. No road, no sign of life. Just a vast, empty expanse of land stretching into oblivion. He took a step forward, then another, drawn by some invisible force. And as he did, the voice returned, louder this time, more insistent. "You're already part of it now. You can never leave." Alex's mind was spiraling. The words echoed in his skull, each one sending a ripple of fear down his spine. "You can never leave." He looked around, but there was nothing, just the dark, endless expanse that seemed to stretch on forever. He turned to the car, but it had disappeared, as if swallowed whole by the earth. The ground beneath his feet was soft, shifting with every step he took, almost like it was alive, like it was trying to pull him under. A shadow flickered in his peripheral vision. Alex whipped around, his breath caught in his throat. There was no one there, nothing but the endless void. But the feeling of being watched, being hunted, was unmistakable. He wasn't alone. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice trembling in the silence. But the air remained still, too still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the ground beneath his feet trembled, a low rumble vibrating through the soil. The earth cracked open in front of him, and from the fissure, a dark figure emerged, slowly, steadily, as if it had been waiting for him all along. The figure was massive, its form indistinct and shadowy, yet its presence felt solid, suffocating. It moved toward him, its steps heavy and deliberate. Alex stumbled backward, his legs shaking, his heart racing. The whispers returned, this time more urgent, more desperate. "Run, before it's too late." But Alex's feet felt rooted to the ground, his body refusing to obey his frantic commands. The figure loomed closer, its form finally taking shape. It was no longer just a shadow. It had eyes, eyes that glowed an unnatural, sickly yellow, and they were locked on him. As the figure reached out, Alex's mind screamed, but his body was paralyzed. The air around him thickened, the temperature plummeting. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the figure closed in on him. And then, just as its hand was inches from his chest, a deafening sound, like the cracking of bones, split the silence. The figure froze, its body jerking violently. Something within it seemed to shift, twist, and then, in a blink, it was gone, vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the echo of its unnatural presence. Alex gasped for air, his body finally responding, his legs giving way as he collapsed to the ground. The whispers had stopped, but the fear still clung to him, suffocating him in its grip. What was that? What was happening? He couldn't understand. Everything had felt so real, so solid. But now, there was nothing left but the endless, empty land. As Alex pulled himself to his feet, a new sensation washed over him. Something was wrong with the very air. The ground beneath him had shifted again, this time forming a path leading deeper into the darkness. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Alex could feel it. Something was guiding him, pulling him toward that path. With no other choice, he stepped forward, his steps slow and hesitant. As he moved down the path, the world around him began to distort. The landscape stretched and warped, the sky above twisting like a nightmare unraveling. The trees, once still, now swayed in unnatural ways, their trunks bending like they were made of rubber. And then, A voice, different from the others, whispered in his ear, cold and mocking. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" Alex froze. The voice wasn't coming from any direction. It was inside his mind, swirling around his thoughts like poison. He knew, without a doubt, that something far more ancient and sinister was at play. This wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a nightmare constructed from his own fears and regrets. And he had just stepped deeper into it. Alex's breath quickened as the air around him grew colder, the ground beneath him colder still. The path ahead seemed endless, stretching out like a maze that had no beginning and no end. Every step he took felt heavier, as if the world itself was conspiring to hold him in place. The trees around him bent and twisted unnaturally, their branches contorting into grotesque shapes. He glanced over his shoulder, but the way he had come from was now a wall of thick, dark mist. There was no turning back. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse, deafening. It wrapped around him like a shroud, pressing in from all sides. Alex could feel his heartbeat in his throat, each pulse a loud, frantic drumbeat. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep walking, but there was no choice. The path seemed to pull him forward, urging him to move. The air around him shimmered, and for a moment, Alex thought he saw something, someone, out of the corner of his eye. He spun around, but there was no one, just the dense darkness closing in on him. His fingers tightened around his jacket, and the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. He couldn't escape it. No matter where he went, it was there, lurking in the shadows. And then, a sound, a faint scratching, echoed from the trees. It was slow at first, like something dragging across the earth. Alex froze, his breath caught in his chest. The sound was getting closer, sharper, like claws scraping the ground. He slowly turned his head, and in the dim light, he saw something moving through the shadows. A shape, crawling on all fours, just out of sight. It wasn't human. Its body was long and thin, with limbs too long for any creature Alex had ever seen. The creature seemed to melt into the shadows as it moved, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was a part of the darkness itself. Alex's pulse raced. He had to move. He had to get out of here, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. It was like something was holding him back, keeping him rooted to the spot. The creature's growls grew louder, its breath heavy and wet as it came closer, inch by inch. Just as Alex was about to turn and run, the creature lunged, its claws scraping against the ground, reaching for him. But in that instant, it froze. The air around Alex turned to ice, and the world seemed to stop. The creature was no longer moving. It was trapped in place, frozen in midair, its eyes wide with fear. A voice, colder than the wind, echoed through Alex's mind. "It's not what you think, Alex. It's not the creature you should fear." Suddenly, the creature vanished, dissolving into the mist like a bad dream. Alex stood in the silence, his heart racing. What had just happened? What was this place, this nightmare? And what was it that he was truly running from? Ahead of him, the path twisted again, leading into a tunnel of darkness so thick he couldn't see past the first few steps. The oppressive weight of the silence pressed down harder than ever. But something was calling him from inside the tunnel, pulling him in. And despite every ounce of instinct telling him to turn around, Alex took a step forward. As Alex stepped forward into the tunnel, the oppressive silence deepened, closing in on him like a vice. His eyes struggled to adjust to the thick darkness, the air growing colder with each passing second, and his breath visible in the dim light. He could feel the walls of the tunnel pressing in on him, the ground beneath him shifting, as though the very path was alive, watching him with an unseen gaze. His heart thudded loudly in his chest, each beat growing more frantic. The whisper, the same haunting voice, echoed in his mind again. But this time it was different, more insistent, more personal, as if the darkness itself was speaking directly to him. "You are part of the cycle now. There is no escape." Alex's body tensed as the words swirled through his thoughts, and the weight of them settled over him. heavy and suffocating. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, and he could feel himself being drawn deeper, despite the terror clawing at his insides, telling him to turn back, to run. But he couldn't. The tunnel seemed to have no end, just an abyss of inky blackness that swallowed up everything around him. The further he went, the more the air felt thick with a strange, almost tangible energy, a presence that seemed to ripple through the very fabric of the darkness. Suddenly, a flicker of light, so faint it was almost imperceptible, appeared ahead of him, a pale glow like the moon trapped behind layers of fog. It beckoned him forward, an unnatural pull that Alex couldn't resist. He moved closer, each step heavy, as if the ground was becoming more unstable with every inch. The light grew brighter, but as it did, the shadows around him deepened, becoming more aggressive, clawing at his legs, tugging at his clothing. The temperature dropped even further, his breath now coming out in sharp, visible gasps. He could feel a presence in the air, swirling around him, unseen, but undeniably real. He wasn't alone. As Alex reached the glowing light, he was struck by the eerie beauty of the sight before him. In the center of the tunnel stood a stone pedestal, ancient and covered in vines, with a glowing orb placed carefully upon it. The orb pulsed with an ethereal light, like the beating of a heart, and then, as if in slow motion, Alex reached out, his hand trembling, as though some force outside of him was guiding his movements. His fingers brushed against the orb, and in that instant, everything changed. The tunnel seemed to collapse in on itself, twisting and warping as if the very fabric of reality had been unraveled. The orb grew brighter, blindingly so, and then, nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. Alex could no longer feel the tunnel around him. The world seemed to have vanished completely. He was standing in a void, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of doom. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but it was like everything he had known, everything he had been, was slipping through his fingers. There was no sound, no light, no direction, just an endless, suffocating darkness. And then, in the far distance, a voice, low, familiar and chilling, whispered through the void, sending a shiver down his spine. "You have chosen your fate, Alex. Welcome to the eternal waiting place." The words echoed, and in that instant, Alex knew that whatever this place was, it wasn't just a dream. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was real, and he was trapped within it. The orb had done something to him, opened something he couldn't understand, and now, there was no way out. The shadows, the whispers, the figures, everything was part of this place. He was part of it now, and the worst part, he couldn't remember when it all began. Had he ever been outside? Had he ever been free? The thought gnawed at him, but it was quickly drowned by the voice, now louder, more urgent. "It's too late, Alex. You'll never escape the shadows. You've always been here." The voice echoed through the void, reverberating against Alex's very soul. "You've always been here." The words slithered around him, suffocating him with their truth. His head spun, and for a moment, he couldn't tell where he was or who he was anymore. The shadows closed in tighter, their cold, invisible fingers crawling over his skin. He tried to move, but his body felt like it was encased in concrete. No matter how much he willed himself to run, to escape, his feet refused to budge. The void had a grip on him, and it was tightening with every passing second. Desperation clawed at him. He needed to understand. He needed to know why he was here. But the answers seemed just out of reach, like the final puzzle piece hidden in a sea of darkness. The orb, that strange glowing sphere, was still there, pulsing with an eerie rhythm, but it was no longer comforting. It had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, everything that was keeping him trapped. The once soft glow was now harsh, blinding, as though the light itself was mocking him. He forced his legs to move, dragging his body toward the orb. Each step felt like wading through thick mud. As he approached it, the shadows seemed to part momentarily, revealing something just behind the pedestal. His heart skipped a beat. There, half hidden in the darkness, was a figure. It was not human. It was something worse, something older. Its eyes glowed with the same sickly yellow light as the creature from before. But these eyes were hollow, voids of emptiness, as though they were sucking in the very light around them. The figure's face was obscured by a mask of what looked like cracked porcelain, but the cracks weren't just on the surface. They ran deep, as if the mask itself was a part of its soul. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but Alex could feel its presence, as if it were watching him, waiting for him to understand something that he couldn't quite grasp. A shiver ran down his spine as the silence stretched on, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of his heart. Without warning, the figure's arm reached out, its fingers long and unnaturally thin, like the twisted branches of a tree. Alex flinched, expecting the worst, but the figure didn't touch him. Instead, it pointed toward the orb, its eyes narrowing as though urging him to look deeper into the glowing sphere. His mind raced. What was it trying to tell him? What was this orb? He stepped closer, his hand shaking as he reached out, his fingers brushing against the surface of the orb. Instantly, a flood of images crashed into his mind. Flashbacks of places he didn't recognize, faces he had never seen, and a sense of overwhelming dread that filled every inch of his being. There were flashes of screams, of despair, and of endless darkness swallowing everything whole. And then, as if the images had a purpose, they stopped. One final vision lingered in his mind, a tall, dark figure standing in the distance, staring at him. The figure had a face, but it was warped, shifting. Its eyes were the same yellow glow, but its mouth was a gaping abyss. As Alex stared at it, he realized with a jolt that the figure was him. It was his own reflection, distorted and monstrous, standing in the depths of an endless night. "You are the key," the voice whispered again, now clearer, more certain. "And you are the door." The words felt like a slap to the face. What did it mean? What was he the key to? The door to what? But before he could process it, the shadows lunged at him. They enveloped him, wrapping around him like chains, pulling him toward the abyss. His body was no longer his own. It was being dragged, twisted, forced toward the depths of the void, into the very heart of this place. The figure watched, its eyes never leaving him as he was swallowed whole. As the shadows closed in around Alex, pulling him toward the endless void, a deep sense of calm washed over him. The panic that had once consumed him began to fade, replaced by a peaceful stillness that felt both foreign and familiar. The abyss, once so terrifying, now seemed like an inevitable part of the universe, a space between moments, a place where time and fear had no meaning. The weight of the darkness, the suffocating silence, all began to dissolve, as if Alex had entered a new plane of existence, one that was both terrifyingly strange and deeply comforting. The figure, still watching him with those hollow eyes, didn't move. But in the silence, Alex could finally hear the soft rhythm of his own breath, the steady beat of his heart. It was as if the world had momentarily paused, allowing him to simply be. Slowly, the shadows loosened their grip, and Alex felt himself being lifted from the depths, not by force, but by some unseen force of his own will. The void was no longer pulling him under. It was guiding him upward, toward something more serene. Above him, the mist parted, revealing a sky filled with stars. But these stars were different. They shimmered with an ethereal light, soft and warm, casting a gentle glow over everything. The ground beneath him was no longer dark and cold, but soft and warm, like a meadow at twilight. The figure in front of him slowly faded, becoming nothing more than a wisp of smoke, until it was gone completely. Alex felt a strange sense of clarity, as though all the confusion, the fear, and the uncertainty had finally been lifted. He stood in the peaceful stillness of this new world, a world where the shadows no longer held power. There were no more whispers, no more terror, just the quiet hum of the universe whispering its age-old secrets to him. In that moment, Alex understood. This place wasn't a prison. It was a journey. The shadows, the fear, had been part of the path, leading him to this peaceful revelation. The orb had been the catalyst for his awakening, a way to find peace within the chaos. The stars above twinkled brightly, and the soft breeze whispered through the trees, their leaves rustling like a lullaby. Alex closed his eyes, letting the calm wash over him completely. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was free. Free from the shadows, free from fear, free from the haunting uncertainty of his existence. He had found his way out, not by escaping, but by understanding. As the peaceful glow of the stars enveloped him, Alex took a final deep breath. He had come full circle, no longer lost in the dark, but at peace in the light. Do you believe that even in our darkest moments, there is a path to peace and clarity? Or is there always something lurking in the shadows? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let me know what you think about Alex's journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more mysterious and thought-provoking stories. Stay tuned for the next adventure, and remember, sometimes the darkest paths lead to the most beautiful discoveries.